Hello, and welcome to From Another Angle, a Carnegie Council podcast. I'm Hilary Sutcliffe, and I'm on the board of the Carnegie Council for AI and Equality. In this series, I get to talk to some of today's most innovative thinkers who take familiar concepts like democracy or human nature, regulation, or even the way we think about ourselves and show them to us from a quite different angle. What really excites me about these conversations is the way they challenge our fundamental assumptions. Certainly for me, and I hope for you too, their fresh thinking makes me see the world in a new way and opens up a whole raft of possibilities and ways of looking at the future. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Susie Alegre, who is an international human rights lawyer whose focus is digital and neuro rights. She's a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And we're going to talk about our freedom of thought from another angle. Now, many of us are concerned about the influence of technology on our lives. We might worry about threats to our freedom of expression or our privacy being eroded. What we say might be up for grabs to the highest bidder online, but at least our thoughts are our own. Whatever our thoughts, however different they are from what we would actually say out loud, at least we know they're ours and no one can get at them or penalise us for them. What goes on in my head stays in my head, or so I thought. Susie has written a powerful new book called Freedom to Think, which was Book of the Year for 2022 in the Financial Times and the Daily Telegraph, which shows that not only is our freedom of thought under threat, but we have pretty much given it away for free and lost it without even knowing we have. But perhaps it's not too late. Susie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Hilary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before reading your book, Susie, I hadn't really given too much thought to threats, to what you lawyers call the forum internum, or what goes on in my head. But it really seems that I should have. So could you start us from the beginning and help us understand what is this human right of freedom of thought, and what does it practically mean for us?
Of course. Well, the right to freedom of thought as a legal human right stems from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is in fact 75 years old this year. So we've had a technical international legal right to freedom of thought for 75 years now. Before that, philosophers, ethicists and others have talked about freedom of thought as a natural right, and this idea that, well, of course, we have freedom of thought, but no one can get inside our heads, and therefore it's a natural right. It's not something that can be taken away, so we don't need to worry too much about protecting it. But when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War, the drafters recognised that actually, yes, we do have this right, and we need to explain a little bit more about what it is and why it's important as one of the fundamental rights that make us human and that should be enforced. But even though it was written down in law, it's not surprising that you haven't thought much about it, because frankly, not many people had. There was very little written about it, very little jurisprudence or consideration given to the right to freedom of thought, as opposed to the right to freedom of religion and belief or the right to freedom of expression until very recently. But what was written about it, what was clear in the academic analysis and in the limited case law, was that the right to freedom of thought, along with the right to freedom of belief and freedom of opinion, have two aspects, if you like. There's two different aspects of the right. One is the right to say what you think, which we see in freedom of expression, or the right to manifest our religious beliefs, which we see in going to church or praying or making religious ceremonies. But there was also an inner aspect to freedom of thought, religion, belief, and opinion. And it's that inner aspect, as you've mentioned, that's described as the forum internum. And academics have looked at that and said, well, what exactly is freedom of thought? And it's, as I say, when you take all these different bits of what goes on inside us, it's the whole idea of our inner lives. It's what we do on the inside, how we feel, how we think, on the inside. And while those external aspects of the right can be limited in certain circumstances, so you have the right to freedom of expression until you use it to destroy other people's rights, and then it can be limited according to the law. Similar with religion, you have a right to freedom of religion, but you don't have the right to destroy other people's rights in the name of manifesting your religion or belief. But what goes on inside our heads, what goes on inside us, is protected absolutely in international human rights law. Very few rights are protected absolutely. And the other two most common absolute rights that give an idea of how it works are things like the prohibition on torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and the prohibition on slavery. And so when you're dealing with an absolute right, what that means is that there can never be a justification for interfering with the right. So you can't torture someone in order to get a confession because that will help national security. You can never, ever use torture. It's just absolutely prohibited. And the same goes for interfering with our inner lives. But obviously, there's a real question there of then, well, what does it mean? What does an interference with our inner lives look like? And there are three key points to consider in that, although where the lines are remains to be seen. I think we'll see it as case law develops, and we see it very much in case studies. But those three key elements are the right to keep our thoughts private, so nobody can force us to reveal what we're thinking. The right not to have our inner thoughts manipulated, and clearly we always, in our day-to-day interactions, we influence each other. My job is as an advocate to persuade people that my perspective is the right one, but I hope never to be actually falling the wrong side of manipulation. And the third aspect is the right not to be penalised for our thoughts alone. So again, you might be penalised for expressing thoughts in a way that destroys the rights of others or that incites violence, for example. But you can never be penalised simply for either what you think or for what someone else thinks you think. And that was one of the things that the drafters recognised as really important in protecting our right to freedom of thought, was that inferences about what we're thinking can often be as dangerous and may equally be an interference with our right to freedom of thought, whether or not they're correct. And so one of the things in the book that I looked at was the history of witch hunts. And frankly, I think this gives an example of why inferences can be as dangerous whether or not they're right. That if the witch finder general turns up and decides that you're a witch because of your black cat and the wart on your nose, an inference that is clearly damning, it doesn't matter whether or not you've had a witchy thought in your life, you're very likely to still be burned at the stake for a witch. And that's one of the reasons why I explored these sort of historic examples, because I think they give really good views on what it means to not have freedom of thought, and which way it leads if we lose our freedom of thought.
And so bringing us bang up to date with this from witches to now, I was quite struck by the way in the book you picked apart the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica case study with those three thoughts in mind. Can you give us that? Because what hadn't struck me before, really how influential that was in areas that actually I didn't really read about in the newspapers.
Yes, for me, Cambridge Analytica was the real light bulb moment. Before that, I hadn't thought about freedom of thought at all either. But I remember very clearly reading an article about Cambridge Analytica before it became front page news in early 2017, and when it was connected to both Brexit and to the Trump election. So, as I was sitting there thinking, well, how could these things have happened, as many human rights lawyers, Europeans were, reading this article just chilled me to the bone. And while people were talking about, data protection and privacy, both, crucial things that I'd worked on for years, but had never really felt so viscerally, I thought this goes beyond data protection and privacy. Data protection and privacy are gateway rights, if you like, but I thought this is about our freedom of thought and potentially my freedom of thought. And what, really struck me was this idea that it can be very subtle, and that perhaps, my Facebook feed had lulled me into a false sense of security because all my friends agreed that the referendum was pointless and that we would never leave the European Union. And therefore, I didn't really see it as a major threat at the time. I didn't go out and campaign. I just assumed that life would go on as usual and didn't see this seismic change coming. And the idea that that might have been because of manipulation, whether or not it was, I'm a Facebook user, could have been, may not have been, but the idea that that could have happened and that could be happening to all of us or any of us at any time really, really disturbed me. And that was the first moment I thought, this is about my freedom of thought. This is about all our freedom of thought and how that then potentially impacts on our democracy. And when I started to look into it, as I mentioned earlier, there was very little written on the right to freedom of thought. So I kind of assumed I must be barking up the wrong tree and that maybe I'd missed something. But when I looked at it and saw, okay, this is an absolute right, that means it's something really significant that can't be thrown into the balancing act that we often see with other human rights. It can't be in that question of, well, protecting one's right with another right. This is something where there can never be equivocation about it. And that to me seemed to be really powerful. And then when I found these three elements and thought about them in terms of Cambridge Analytica, I saw that effectively what they were offering, the service that Cambridge Analytica was selling through Facebook, was firstly an insight into our inner thoughts, feelings, and character. So to understand our psychological vulnerabilities as individuals en masse, and to use those insights and inferences to go back in and press our psychological buttons in a way that would manipulate us and ultimately manipulate our voting behavior. Not changing someone from, a Trump voter to a Democrat, or a Brexiteer to a Remainer, or vice versa, but potentially changing whether or not you could be bothered to get off the sofa, depending on which way you were likely to vote and what kind of a person you were. And that then, when you're looking at very small margins in elections, has the power to completely change all of our futures, including, as we've seen, whether or not we have human rights protections down the line in the future. These are very important elections. I mean, in any election is crucial to our democracy. The idea that the results of elections could be manipulated through effectively, AI and data being used to infer things about us and use that to manipulate us was something that I just found utterly disturbing. And as I say, it kind of hits on those three elements. It's about getting inside our heads, understanding how they work, using that to manipulate us in ways that may well be to our detriment or may well penalize us down the line. And if you think about it as well, it's potential, there is potential for this kind of inference to be used to literally stop people going in to the voting booth in different ways. And we've seen the developments on from Cambridge Analytica, some researchers claiming that just from a still photograph of you, they can make inferences about your political opinions. And if you think about that kind of technology then being used just to scan your face going in to vote, you can see how dangerous that might be in terms of the problems that might suddenly be found in relation to you as a legitimate voter.
Yes, terrifying. But it's interesting to say as well that from your book, I found out that Obama used this sort of micro-targeting first. So this is
Absolutely
not some Trumpian conspiracy here.
No, and I think that's one thing that's really, really important, is that it doesn't matter who's using it. If it is an interference with our right to freedom of thought, it has to be banned. It can never be legitimate. And it doesn't matter if it's your guy who's using it or the other guy who's using it, it's not okay.
And I think similarly, some real shockers in your book on criminal justice and inferring from very dubious technologies things about lying, about guilt, about all sorts of things. Tell us some more about those.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cases that I looked at in the book was an Indian case where effectively neuroimaging of a woman on trial for murder was used to demonstrate that she was lying, and that she was, I think it was the first conviction worldwide based entirely on the neuroimaging to be an assessment of the veracity of what she was saying in court. That conviction was later overturned, but it really highlights how technology being used to read our minds in that kind of way by sort of, looking at the colors as your brain whirs into action in response to a highly stressful situation, are potentially interferences with our right to freedom of thought, although they haven't been dealt with legally as such yet. And that's one of the areas that I think really is ripe for discussion and legal development, to see actually where are the limits to neuroscience looking at what's going on inside our heads, whether it's in a criminal justice system, but it could be in an educational system, it could be in an employment situation. Again, lie detectors are used very often in employment screening and security screening. And I think there's a very big question, not just about whether the tech works, but whether actually it's a legitimate technology to be used, a legitimate technique to be used.
Absolutely. I think also going onto the workplace, I mean, obviously from COVID, I did quite a lot of work on trust, and it was quite clear that employers didn't trust their employees because they were surveilled and micromanaged every keystroke. Can you also tell us more about how the future of the workplace might be, have the implications of freedom of thought and the use of this sort of technology in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing increasingly before you even get into the workplace, in the recruitment area, the idea of AI being used to pass CVs and to decide whether or not somebody's the right kind of person, which, rather predictably has flagged up bias issues where suddenly, if you're not the right kind of person to be a CEO, maybe if you're, a woman, for example, then you don't have the right profile when the AI looks through and compares to successful CEOs in the past. And what we're seeing increasingly is the use of AI video interviews. So AI being run through a computer interview with someone to decide whether or not they're the right kind of person, reading between the lines. So it's not about what they say, it's about the body language, effectively, or the tone of your voice, the kind of words that you use. And, you don't need to be, you don't need to be a genius to work out that way lies discrimination and bias and prejudice. And effectively the inferences being made about people based on their accent, the way that they look at the camera, the way that they hold themselves, all of which are often very much dictated by background, class, whatever it might be. Those are the kind of things that the AI is reading to decide whether or not you're the right sort of person for the job. Then when you get into the job, we're seeing increasingly employers using AI both to monitor, as you've said, but also to push and manipulate people. So what we can see in AI management techniques are nudges, if you like, that keep people on the job all the time, that keep people nervous, that keep people engaged, so that you're never quite sure whether you're going to have a job tomorrow, and that keeps you on the job. What we can see from things like technology that tells you to take specific routes, for example, may undermine your ability, your autonomy, your feeling of having control of yourself and your own life. And the monitoring as well. I think one of the examples that I put in the book was a company who had introduced technology so that you would only be allowed into a meeting room if you were smiling. So you have to make sure that you've got the proper positive attitude before you can join a meeting. And I mean, that is just so Orwellian. Having reread 1984, that was exactly what George Orwell was talking about back in the day, was that when faced with the ubiquitous telescreen, everyone just has to have a completely fixed smile, expressionless face, effectively, to make sure that no inferences can be made about any subversive ideas or any questioning that might be going on behind your eyes. And this is what we are effectively living with now, as well as we're seeing it in schools too. Concentration monitoring happening on children, including potentially a head monitor, so that lights can flash up to tell the teacher that you're not concentrating properly. And when you think about what those things mean for us as human beings, it really is chilling and horrifying. And it does effectively have a chilling effect, not only on what you say and how you behave, but ultimately on what you let yourself think.
Absolutely. I mean, some of those are truly horrifying. You can't even imagine that. A lot of this for me is, who's buying this? Who's selling it to them? And how is this even happening? But I like as well what you were saying about this idea of the ability to keep your thoughts private, because this sort of intrusion just shapes your thoughts. It shapes the way you actually approach the world. It actually changes everything. And that simply, just for somebody to make some money, is truly frightening.
Yeah, it really is. It absolutely is. And I think it goes back to that question of regulation and what should be allowed to be developed effectively. There need to be limits on what can be done with technology. And I think as well, it's really important to bear in mind that for technologists themselves and entrepreneurs, this kind of environment does not lend itself to innovation and creativity. Tech innovation going down this route will eat itself.
Yes, absolutely. Which brings us back to the law, to your area of expertise. Now, I do a lot of work on responsible innovation and trying to have organizations think in an ethical way, which has not been wildly working, to be honest. So I in recent years, I've actually been coming to see that the law really is where we have to start. And I love your quote about human rights law as opposed to ethics. You call human rights law ethics with teeth, and I really like that. But explain to us about how ethics and human rights work together.
I mean, ultimately, human rights is the legal embodiment of ethics. It comes from ethics. And, if you study law, you have to study ethics as well. Human rights law is a way of saying, these are the very clear boundaries. I mean, that said, the way the law works is iterative, and where those boundaries are develops over time, both through looking at particular case studies and saying, here's the limit and here's not. But also as our societies develop. So we see human rights law evolves with us. It's not set in stone. And I think that's something that's very different from the way, for example, the US Constitution is viewed. When we look at international human rights law, particularly from a European perspective, they are absolutely viewed as living instruments. And so it's not what the drafters meant, it's what those concepts mean today which matters, and which makes human rights law a very progressive way of dealing with ethics. And so one example of that is, the Isle of Man, where I come from, was slightly unfortunately the home of a really seminal judgment in the European Court of Human Rights, where in the 1970s, the Isle of Man was still using corporal punishment on young men who were convicted of violent offences generally. So they would be given the birch by police as a legal corporal punishment. Now, corporal punishment was common across the Council of Europe when the European Convention on Human Rights was developed, 20, 30 years before. So the big question was, by the 1970s, was corporal punishment inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment? And the court decided that yes, by the 1970s it was, because pretty much all Council of Europe countries had abolished corporal punishment in that time. And so while for the drafters, it would have been pretty much straightforward, a normal part of life, by the 1970s, it wasn't. And that's how human rights law has remained really current, and how we see its development being applied to technology and practice. And it's one of the things that we've seen around the right to private life, how that has been adapted and evolved, particularly through the use of the right to protection of our personal data, to make it really relevant and developed for the 21st century. And we're only now really starting to talk about the right to freedom of thought in that context. But human rights law has the power and the ability to adapt to new situations and create new legal frameworks that we can all use.
Yes, I was actually quite suspicious myself sometimes with this proliferation of ethics frameworks, which are sensible in many ways, but could they sometimes be an evasion of the responsibility and a distraction from looking at these things in a legal way? But also really interesting to look at how concepts like fairness, which are central to the ethical debate, have been debated for quite some time in the law and in human rights law. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we don't have to have new special rights.
Completely. One of the things that I'm a bit cynical of, like you, is that the development of ethics, particularly in relation to AI and technology, is that being used as a way of saying there's nothing to see here, we don't need to worry about the law, and to say effectively there is no law, we can just ignore that and make up a new thing. And while I recognize that that there can be problems with the law, in that what you don't want is a massive proliferation of expensive litigation about everything, what you do want is a legal framework that makes it clear and helps you think about what should never be allowed. Where are the lines which you should never cross? And in my view, international human rights law gives you that basis. It doesn't throw up a huge amount of potential for, as I say, high value litigation. But what it does do is create a legal framework, particularly to push governments towards regulation. Because one of the important things about human rights law is that it has a positive obligation for the state as well as a negative obligation. So the state cannot trample all over our human rights, cannot violate our human rights by the actions it takes. For example, police using AI to predict criminality and then convict people on that basis. But it also creates this positive obligation to prevent us from harming each other, including preventing corporations from harming each other, and to protect us from dangerous environments. So one of the examples I used in the book was the European Court of Human Rights finding that Romania had violated a woman's right to physical integrity because it had failed to deal with the wild dog problem in Bucharest. And as a result, she had been attacked by a load of wild dogs and had been seriously injured. Now, clearly, the Romanian government didn't set the dogs on her, but they knew about the problem and they failed to act. And I think that is a very useful perspective when thinking about future technology, when thinking about developments in AI. When we're aware of something dangerous coming down the track, it is on governments to make sure that they regulate to protect us from it.
Yes, I think now they can't say that they weren't told. There's you and a number of others, it's pretty clear what's going on. But give us some hope. I think I'm pleased to see at the end of your book, you're really talking about there's a lot of work being going on, not just on privacy, but also on this new area of freedom of thought. And as individuals and our governments, particularly in Europe, are now beyond that stage of, oh my goodness, what we're going to do, and are doing some concrete things. Do you have any hope for us, personally, from the government's point of view and from the law point of view, and also from our own point of view of what we can do?
I really do have hope, actually. And I was thrilled this year because at the end of last year, I wrote an article in the Wired World 2023 predicting that 2023 would be the year that we started to see the end of what Shoshana Zuboff has called the surveillance capitalism model, particularly around targeted advertising on which Cambridge Analytica and other similar things were built.
Yeah.
And what we saw in the first week of 2023 was a European Data Protection Board ruling saying that actually the targeted advertising business model of Facebook and Instagram is unlawful in European law. That is huge. That immediately shakes the foundations of the driver behind tech that surveils us and manipulates us. It's taking away the money, potentially, which I think might change the direction of developments in technology. So we are seeing shifts, and I couldn't believe that it had happened so fast and that my predictions were coming about so quickly. But also, as you've mentioned, there are so many people doing incredible work on digital rights. It really is a space that is developing very fast, and we're seeing people taking cases to court all over the world to challenge these issues, but also raising awareness. And, you know, for me, the reason for writing this book was to get the message out to the general public and to people who don't know about human rights, don't know why they matter to them, and don't really understand how the technology that we're all using every day might be impacting on their human rights now and in the future. And one of the triggers for me was actually looking at it from a personal perspective, using tools to find out how Facebook or Twitter see me. You can find a website where you can enter your social media data and get a reading of the inferences of what it says about you. And so I was quite thrilled looking at Twitter to find out that I was a 30-something man, which probably indicates that I very much use Twitter for professional reasons. And therefore, I'm not giving away too much about myself on Twitter. But even though it was completely off beam, it makes you realize what assumptions are being made about you and how those might be used against you, and gives you an idea of the kind of data trails that you're leaving. Another thing for me was to look at the amount of phone use. And, you know, I've written an entire book about this. I still struggle with my own phone and have to put limitations on it. And I use an app aptly called the Freedom app to prevent myself when I need to focus, to switch it on so that effectively I can't look at any of the apps. I can't check my emails. I can't have a quick gander on Twitter. And so identifying tools that you can use to reduce your dependency on tech, understanding how you engage with tech, but also really importantly, finding out about organizations that are doing the work and supporting them, because there is incredible work going on out there. Organizations and activists need support to do the work, to change our futures and to make our governments sit up and take notice and make the changes we need.
On that fantastic note, thank you very much, Susie Alegre. We'll be putting the links to Susie's book, some of the articles she's written, and links she talked about in the podcast underneath. So, Susie, thank you very much for being with us, and really good luck with your incredibly important and interesting work. And we hope actually things progress as you predicted, even faster. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.